had then a question on breaking permission inheritance and what the ramifications of that are. Todd, I think you have some things to say about this, so go ahead. Go for Todd.
Yeah, don't.
Oh, he has nothing to say.
No, don't break permission.
All right, you crazy people, let's start it off. So today's Sympraxis on the 4th of October, 2023. We are all here except Emily. The aliens abducted her last time, and apparently they still have her. We're not sure if she's going to be let go anytime soon, so we'll see how that works out. So
I can't blame them though, right? It's Emily. Like, why would they let her go?
I was thinking the same, right? Like, I'd want to keep her too.
Yeah, hell yeah.
So today's topic is Sympraxis anything. There's not very many slides. We have one because I wanted to include a screenshot to answer this, but in general, today is all about your questions. So if you're on the call live, please feel free to use the raise hand feature, come off mute, ask your question. We'd love to have a discussion with you live. If not, you can also, or if you're not comfortable with that, you can also type your messages in the chat, and Derek is going to be my proctor, and he's going to let me know when I have something that I need to say something about.
She doesn't let me
I just nominated him like right away. No, Mark, you are in charge of pontificating. That's your job. And Todd's here for the joke.
That's a new title for him. Chief Pontificator.
Yes,
CPO.
I love it.
Pontificator. Yeah. CPO. All right, like it.
And Todd's chief jester. So
stick with what works.
Yeah, you know, we do what we can. Okay, so we had a question from one of our regular listeners who's also a client about regulatory forms. And this one is a pretty tricky thing to answer because essentially what the question is around the idea that there's a certain look and feel that the form has to have to meet regulatory standards. Probably there's some auditing rules around that, lots of other things. So I think that the short answer is probably you would have to build something custom so that you could meet all the requirements exactly. Without knowing what those requirements are, I don't think we could give much better guidance than that. But I think essentially the answer is it would have to be a custom form. I mean, you know, not quite sure that there's any other ways.
I think with anything where you're collecting information, you have to, you know, pontificate. You have to collect your requirements and see which of the apps or services are closest and whether the trade-offs you'd have to make are a problem. So, you know, Microsoft Forms or SharePoint List or a Power App or a whatever. And then if your requirements can't be met by any of those things, obviously you're going to try to use the out-of-the-box stuff if you can. But if you can't, Julie's right. I mean, you can build anything these days.
Right. And I mean, there is the ability for doing, so if you wanted to use a list to collect the data, there is the ability to create your own custom forms. And we've maybe talked about that before, but the idea that the SharePoint framework now has form customizer so that you can take over the add/new, the edit experience, and the and the view experience, excuse me, those three. And so you have the ability to completely customize that form in any way that you want to. And you can do a lot with that because you have complete control over it. You can even sort of bypass certain permissions. Like if everyone has contribute rights to a list, for example, you can make your form, your edit form, decide whether they're actually meet some other criteria as to whether or not they get an actual editable experience versus a view experience. And it's a trick that we've started using in some of the customizations where we need it. So small amount of customization in the sense that you're just doing a SharePoint framework form customizer, but you're still using an out-of-the-box list. You still have all that power, but you're turning off the ability for them to edit the list in place, and you're giving a custom form experience that allows you to curate that form any way you want it to be curated without having to go build something outside in some external system. So there is that as a customization, but it is still customized form. So
Laura mentioned in chat that sorry, Derek, that Derek had mentioned JSON formatting of the layout on one of our previous calls. That is something that you can do relatively easily. It's very similar to list formatting, or sorry, column formatting or view formatting, in that you can add some JSON that changes the way the order in which the columns are displayed in that form, and you can add section headers. So it actually can be really helpful, but it doesn't give you like endless options.
Yeah.
You know, you can add things like icons and things like that if you really think that that's going to make a difference.
Yeah, but you are governed by the SharePoint Chrome. So if you need to live outside of that space and you can't have any of the existing SharePoint UI there, then really the closest you're going to get is the form customizer.
Yeah, and then you still do have some of the Chrome. So if you can't even have like the suite bar and the site header, then you got to go completely outside of the SharePoint environment entirely. And it doesn't mean you can't write the data back to a SharePoint list, or unless that doesn't meet the requirements, but it does mean you'd have to like completely do something outside.
Yep.
Okay, so that was our question on regulatory forms. We had then a question on breaking permission inheritance and what the ramifications of that are. Todd, I think you have some things to say about this, so go ahead. Go for Todd.
Yeah, don't.
Oh, he has nothing to say.
No, don't break permissions. So this is a tricky one, especially for those of us who've been in the SharePoint game for a while, because breaking permissions was a forbidden, horrible thing that nobody should ever do. And I have severed friendships over people breaking inheritance when they shouldn't. And this is the idea that you go into a list or a document or whatever, and you're like, break inheritance, and you have custom permissions and all of that. Back in the day, we could justify that pretty easily by showing performance hits. So when we were with on-prem SharePoint, it could be 10 times slower page loads in document libraries if you broke inheritance. And at the top of every list, there was a bit, a property of each list or library that said, are there any broken inheritance? And if there wasn't, then the UI just showed you everything. If there was, then in the background, SQL and SharePoint would have to figure out every single item, whether you had permission and whether it would show it on the page or not. So there's a really bad performance penalty to doing that. That hasn't been the case in probably 10 years, and certainly not as much the case on SharePoint Online. So that was the thing I always used to do. I'm like, if you want SharePoint to be slower, break permissions and you've got it. These days, though, I still hesitate to suggest it to people because of now it's like a management thing. Now it's just keeping track of who has permission to what. And so Mark Chrisman mentioned in the chat room, you shouldn't do it willy-nilly. If you get into the situation where you find yourself constantly breaking permissions inside of lists and libraries and creating lots of folders and breaking permissions on those, and then creating folders inside of there and breaking permissions on those, you need to ask yourself if you've got something architected incorrectly, because you probably do. So it should be the exception, not the rule. The final thing that I'll say with that is, as much as we tell you not to break inheritance, every time you go near that sharing button, that's exactly what you're doing. In the background, it's breaking inheritance on that object and then adding whoever you share it to. So they had to fix that because that's how they're doing the sharing, but be careful with it.
And we run into this a lot as we're doing some of our migration projects, trying to then decommission older sites, making sure that you clear out that individually shared with kind of setting to make sure that those individual users don't have access to those items anymore and that you're actually inheriting from the parent.
Yeah, I think that's maybe one of the biggest services we do when we migrate content is migrate it without the permissions that have built up over the years. I think wherever possible, you want to think about, can we set permissions at a higher level in order to accomplish what we're doing instead of breaking permissions in a specific place?
Yeah.
By that, I mean, and Greg asked, when is it better to have multiple document libraries versus breaking permissions maybe on a folder or something?
Yeah.
I think if you've got sets of content that are going to consistently have different permission needs, try and think about where it belongs. So for example, if you've got a team site and you need to share 3 documents from that team site and everything else is not shared and should be secret, then figure out where to put those 3 documents so that the people who actually need to get to it don't have to like sort of dig into your team site. So always try to balance managing the permissions with making the work possible. And I know that's a sort of vague way to put it, but I think a lot of the time people are just breaking permissions because they don't realize that there are other options. So educating people that, you know, sometimes a new site is a good thing, or sometimes a new library is a good thing. Lots of people just use the documents library, so of course they have permission inheritance broken all over the place. They're not sort of thinking holistically.
100% agree with that.
Yep.
And I would say that the question about whether you should have a different document library certainly is permission related, but there are other things. If you have, you know, different content types or you know, there's other considerations. But
yeah, if you're building a good information architecture, it starts to become a little more obvious that having different containers will make sense. But you know, the documents library with everything just dumped in it and a lot of folders means you're going to have a permissions mess.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I noticed that Mark Ashman mentioned he never cared about the performance hit. It's always been about supportability and management hit. And I don't disagree with that, except for we've seen some where they couldn't use the document library anymore at all. So then performance ended up being the real issue because it was non-usable.
Yeah, it's hard to believe, but you can only have 50,000 sharing links in a document library.
Shocking.
Who knew?
Shocking.
It seems like a big number until
it's not.
It isn't.
Until it's not.
So you ring that bell and yep.
Yeah. So our next question was about list and library customizations showing up in the web part view. And I was not, I mean, I think this has just been evolving, and that's sort of where this ends up. I have this next slide. I have a particular demo that I do that has various SharePoint framework extensibility things on the list and library. So I have a command. I have a couple of SharePoint framework field customizers, et cetera, et cetera. This is in a list or library, you know, web part. This is a library one for this particular example because it was quick for me to put together, but they're all showing up and we're seeing that they mostly show up as well as in Teams. However, I will say that in Teams, if you add a list and library customization like this, so SharePoint framework extension, and you add a tab, add the list or library to a tab with the SharePoint web part, they don't all work. Some work and some don't work. You have to add the tab as a web, like a web URL. And if you do it that way, it works just fine. And also if you use the Microsoft list, add like if it's a list and you use the Microsoft lists web part, it works that way as well. So there's some nuance with the Teams desktop app and how those tabs show up with extensions, but in general, you can get around them all. So I think those are pretty much handled. So as we were starting the call, Casper was here as usual for our pre-call chat, and he brought up site templates. Casper, do you want to come off mute and just sort of re-ask what you were saying earlier? Because I think it's handy.
Don't be shy, Casper.
He might not want to. You can just like turn your video on.
He's a shrinking little violet. I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, sure. No, it's just I had a customer recently that had a lot of sites where they have used the out-of-the-box site templates. The project site template one, I believe it was, and it comes with 2 different lists. This template, and they were asking me to put up a PnP search portal for that. They want to aggregate all of their lists in those sites. And that was going to be no problem at all until I figured out that those templates, which are, by the way, provided by Microsoft, they don't use content types at all. And they actually don't use site columns neither. So they were just using list columns and no content types. And that screwed my work up heavily I had to do a lot of tricks and workarounds in order to get that up and running. So my question is, should we really avoid using those templates, or at least add something additional in order to make sure that they follow good practice as far as information architecture goes?
I have a pretty strong opinion on that. I mean, obviously, if you can build something right, you should do that. Those templates, I think, are, in a sense, they're like marketing, right? They're a way to show how simple it is to set up a site that is purpose-built, but they are not mature enough. They're not robust enough to fit into an enterprise information architecture, like exactly what you're describing, Casper. I think that the ideas there are often very good ones to get the conversation going. But if you want to have a project site template that matches what your organization does, then you should be building it from scratch anyway. A lot of people just don't know how to do that. So, if they use one of those templates, it's going to get them up and running, and they're going to have something that feels, from an end user perspective, like a very robust solution. And it's great until you want to go to the next level. So yeah. I think it's buyer beware. I think it's ridiculous that Microsoft is putting stuff out that isn't using information architecture or even platform better practices. It makes no sense to me. I think that if you think about it, though, having those content types and those site columns could cause some dependencies at the tenant level if they wanted to do it right? Because you could create multiple project sites and you'd want them to have consistent content type IDs and therefore in consistent site column names. Both of those things are possible, but they haven't thought it through.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think of those as marketing or like maturity level 100 things. Like because I get, so a lot of the bad decisions, like the Fab 40, the single server install, which for those of us who were in SharePoint, 15, 20 years ago, was the worst idea ever. But that was
but all you had to do was push the button.
And then it was all done. One button and next, and you got SharePoint. But those decisions were all made to cater to beginning people. Like Microsoft got their nose bloodied about SharePoint's too tough to install. The analysts, the Gartner folks would say that. So poof, now there's a button. So I think some of those things are kind of like that. They're just like proofs of concept. They're maturity level 100 kind of things. I kind of look at those as like, if you're at the point where you're asking yourself whether that's a good idea or not, you're already past the point where it's a good idea. Like if you don't know it might not be a bad idea, then you're probably the right audience. But if you're questioning those things.
Yeah. I did a demo using for one of my conference sessions using that particular template, Casper. And I mean, I already knew that walking into it. I ended up exporting it and then changing it to use enterprise level or site level site columns and content types, and then re-importing it as a custom one.
That's a good way to sort of solve for that, I suppose. I mean, if you want to have good governance around it, you probably could say, we know you all as an organization want some of these templates. We'll recreate them so that they can be utilized with good information architecture.
Yep.
So we do have a question in the chat from Carol. She is asking about where she goes to get site and page view analytics because she's got some folks that want to be able to view charts that compare views for specific pages and see the specific people that viewed something. I know we can get page analytics from the Pages library. Isn't that correct? Isn't that where it is? Mark Anderson, who's not paying attention, and or Derek.
He blue screen.
You can get page level analytics directly on the page. So
right, okay.
From the page the page details, right next to the page details button, there is an analytics button.
Oh, okay. All right, that's where those are.
And then if you want site level analytics, that's from site contents. There's a
Okay.
little icon up at the top
I've
of the
looked
screen.
at the page level analytics. I guess I was hoping for something more like a data table or a report that I could run so I wouldn't have to run around and look at every page.
Audit
Well,
log.
this-
Caleb
Yeah,
is
so-
putting in the
yeah.
chat. That's a really good answer
Yeah.
that Caleb
Okay.
gave.
Yep, the audit log.
Care-
Go ahead, Caleb.
Sorry, so the audit log is frequently locked down with your global admin, but if you work
I am
with them,
one, so that's okay.
okay. Well, the audit log is tough to work with directly, but we've used application insights in Azure and then extracted stuff from the audit log into data tables and Dataverse to use for reporting, so that we have a better way to look at that stuff, and that way we can also tailor and trim down the information that we're collecting. And you can use application insights to do some custom capture if you add a web part that you put into your sites that feeds to
Okay.
the application insights tables.
Yeah. That's a
Thank you.
great point that he's making. So the audit log can be augmented by any customization that you do can have your own analytics in it that write to App Insights, and then you can export that App Insights to sort of merge it with your audit log exports. But also, if you want to have additional metrics on every page, you can do an app customizer that is tenant-wide deployed that has App Insights embedded in it. And that would then, it's just a small little bit of code that then does page metrics on the page and writes all that to App Insights. There's obviously, or excuse me, App Insights. There's also a cost hit to that, obviously, right? So the App Insights thing is not free. It's not as expensive as it was. I've noticed that price is coming down a little bit, but you get 90 days of logging without paying extra. You get 90 days of logging. So if you want that data, you could, like, on a monthly basis, download the previous month's data. That way, it's rolling and you don't have to worry about it, and download that information and store it elsewhere in some sort of data table somewhere, or curate it out a little bit and just get the pieces you want, and then you could build Power BI reports off it. You could do a whole bunch of other things like that.
Yeah.
There is other third-party tools too that do that kind of stuff if you're super into it, and essentially what they're doing is they're culling that audit log and adding some extra stuff in to do HighGraph is what I'm thinking of. That was bought by somebody with AvePoint. Thank you very much. It does that kind of stuff. So that is a good question.
Okay.
We have a few more minutes. Do we have anybody else that has a question brave enough to come off mute? When we don't have Anderson, we have nobody to pontificate. Our chief pontificating officer has left the building.
Well, I can fill in. So I haven't seen a lot, but the Power Platform thingers going on right now in Vegas, and they're announcing a lot of things besides Power Platform. And so one of them is like there's a new OneDrive page. So nice. So I'll go back to that and I'll go to Casper's question. So even if you're not a Power Platform person, which I'm not, go out there and look. Teepers had some stuff, and so there's been some other M365 White announcements. That's good to see. So Casper was mentioning a conversation that he saw. I can't remember if we had it on Twitter or whatever. So Mark last week was working with a client, and they're scaling by site, which they should, and that meant scaling by group. But there were hundreds, thousands of these, and after we did that, the client realized that those were all showing up in the address list. So when you start typing, emails, they would show up. So they wanted them all to be hidden. And so we were able to change the provisioning process to hide them all automatically. And we were able to find a way with PowerShell to hide all of the groups that were there from the address list. But what he couldn't do was find out if a group was already hidden. So all of the pieces were there except for the whole get. So there was set it hidden, make it hidden, but there was no get. So we found out that there is no way with the PnP PowerShell natively to do that. So I found him some other ways to do that. And Casper was watching that conversation. And so he said, that's great. It's hidden in Azure. It's hidden in the address book and all of that. But how do we hide it in the UPA, the user profile service? I think for that to happen, Casper, we would need some process that copies that attribute over, because I don't think that's one that we can have sync from Azure into the UPA. I haven't checked, and honestly, I'd forgotten you even asked that. So I don't know. So you put graph in there. What about the graph? You put that in the chat.
I was just wondering if they had, if Graph was so mature nowadays that we could set that kind of properties, but they must have banned that for some reason. As far as I can tell, it's not there.
No, the graph has nothing to do with user profile service is too old. Graph will never surface user profile service at all. So the ability to do anything to that will not happen.
Yeah.
So I to set it in intra.
Yeah.
To update it directly.
Yeah, so I think in the background, to Julie's point, the last time anybody touched the user profile code was, I didn't have kids at the time. It was a long time ago. So I'm guessing there's some Rube Goldberg type machine in the background that is syncing those things back and forth with generous amounts of bubblegum and all that. So I think, Casper, so I kind of think what your question was, is there a place in the graph where I can set a value that says sync this field? They could do that if the bubblegum machine were smart enough to read that, but I don't think they put that kind of work into it. So I don't know of any way. I've had to do that for other clients, and this has been years ago, but I set up an Azure function that every night went out, pulled the information down from Azure AD, mucked it all up so it would fit, and then put it in the UPA. And you can do bulk imports to the UPA pretty easily with PowerShell. You can push up a JSON file that will do it. So you might be able to make changes that way.
Yeah, you have to automate that. There is no way for that to be done. And Mark's back when we're done.
2 minutes left, and Mark, did I miss anything? No, we were just sitting around waiting for you.
Yes. I blame Microsoft technology.
Oh, shocking. So, do we have any final? Are there any known issues with the list template? Is it possible to create a document library from an existing one?
I don't know the answer to that one.
Not in the UI. Certainly with PowerShell tools you can. But I don't think there's a whole save site or save list as template. I don't think that
doesn't even that theoretically doesn't exist anymore. So I'm not quite sure where I'm struggling is what list template is. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, lists you can create a list from an existing list. So that functionality is in the UI for lists, but it's not there for document libraries.
Oh,
and that's part of the whole Microsoft works on the things that exactly.
Yeah. Essentially, there's a different team that works on lists that works on libraries. So the two things have different feature sets. Yeah.
And I think that those list templates that are out of the box, that Microsoft provides have some of the same caveats to them that we were talking about with site templates. They're not, you'd think that the things that come from Microsoft would be optimally built, but they aren't necessarily, depending on where you want to go with them.
So Mark, so back to the whole, so Mark Chrisman's asking, because a library isn't just a variation of a list. No, so I don't know how it is today, but I know back in the day, so another one of those old person things, 100 years ago when there was two versions of SharePoint on-prem, SharePoint Foundation or whatever, WSS and Portal server, that's because they were two different teams. And it was because of the antitrust thing. So since they were giving WSS away with Windows, that had to be part of the Windows team, but they wanted you to buy the Portal server. So that had to be a completely separate team, or else the antitrust folks would get on them. So from that, since lists were a core functionality of WSS and some of the publishing things and content management were part of Portal, they had to have separate teams. So inside of Microsoft up until, I don't know, 6-8 years ago for sure, those were two different teams who reported up to the same people, but didn't necessarily always have the same marching orders.
One would
Ah.
think that in the intervening time, they might have solved that
I hope they have. It would make
bifurcation,
sense.
but
yes,
I guess that's not possible.
no idea.
Oh, you just love it. And with that, we have managed to run out of time for this week. October 18th is our next Sympraxis. We do not have an official topic for that yet, so keep an eye on LinkedIn and Twitter, and we will certainly announce it before it happens. But of course, you should all join anyway, because it's going to be fantastic no matter what it is. If you are in the New England area, please consider joining us for Collab Days New England. Registration is open right now. It is October 21st in Burlington, Mass. at the Microsoft Technology Center there. It's going to be a winner of a good time. We're all going to be there except
Julie?
Anderson. It's free,
It's
Mark
free.
Anderson.
No
It's
way.
free.
It's free.
It is
Well, how
free.
can you not go?
I don't know, especially with all the great speakers that we have going there. I mean, it's essentially the same as a paid conference, and it's free. And speaking of paid conferences, Derek and I will be at 365 EduCon in Chicago right after Collab Days New England. We're just jumping from one to the other, and we would love to see you there if you happen to be there. And with that, everyone, have a great rest of your day, and I hope you hope to see you next time. Thanks.
See you next time.
Bye, everybody. Except Mark Christmas.
Thank you so much for joining us this week on Ask Sympraxis. We love getting your questions or session ideas. You can submit by using the link in About. If you find this helpful, hit that like or subscribe button and share this content with your colleagues.